Hey, what is up everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine a city at the edge of the world. Golden pyramids catching the light of a dying sun, their reflective surfaces throwing shards of brilliance across streets of pale marble below. Libraries whose shelves hold knowledge gathered from 100 different star systems, carefully archived over centuries by hands that understood the weight of what they held. Scholars in long robes moving through covered walkways, their conversations a quiet murmur of philosophy and discovery, the kind of intellectual energy that builds civilizations from the ruins of lesser ideas. Above the rooftops, the sky is the particular shade of deep blue that belongs to a coastal world, where ocean and atmosphere exist in that specific balance. And the air carries the salt of the sea alongside something harder to name, a faint electrical charge, a resonance, the persistent whisper of a place where the barrier between the material universe and whatever lies just beyond it is measurably, perceptibly thinner than it is almost anywhere else. This is a city that knows it sits close to something vast. The people who live here were selected for exactly that sensitivity, chosen over generations because they could feel the great ocean beneath reality, the way some people feel weather approaching, in the body, in the skin, as a pressure and a presence rather than a thought. They built their civilization here specifically because this place, with its particular character and its particular closeness to the unseen, was uniquely suited to what they wanted to do. What they wanted to do was understand, to sit at the edge of the known and peer carefully into the unknown, with enough rigor and enough discipline and enough accumulated wisdom to not be consumed by what they found there. That city is called Tzeentch. The people who live there call it the City of Light. And it is going to burn, not someday, not metaphorically, on a morning that the inhabitants of this city have no warning of, no preparation for, and no ability to stop. A morning that is, for the residents going about their early hours, indistinguishable from any other. The sky will fill with fire. The ocean will boil. The mountains that have stood for millions of years will be leveled. And the city itself, the golden pyramids and the great library and the winding streets of old Tzeentch with its centuries of accumulated character, it will be fought over street by street and pyramid by pyramid by transhuman warriors in grey armor who have come, in their minds, to administer justice. The justice will not feel much like justice to the people on the receiving end of it. Welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, this is Q on 40k, where we take the most incredible, layered and morally complex stories that the Warhammer universe has ever produced and give them the space they deserve. No rushing, no shortcuts, just the story, told with care, the way these things need to be told. Tonight, we're going deep into one of the most devastating and morally intricate events in all of Warhammer 40,000 lore. The burning of Prospero. The moment two Space Marine legions, both loyal, both believing with total sincerity that they were doing the right thing, collided in an act of destruction that would echo forward 10,000 years into the present day, through every conflict and every character and every broken landscape of the 41st Millennium. This is a story that has been told before in novels and supplements and sourcebooks from multiple angles and with multiple voices. Graham McNeill told it from inside the Thousand Suns in A Thousand Suns. Dan Abnett told it from inside the Space Wolves in Prospero Burns. Black Library collected those accounts and surrounded them with short stories that filled in corners and explored consequences. There is a depth of creative work behind this event that rewards every hour you spend with it. But tonight, we're going to do something slightly different. We're going to walk through the entire arc, from the very beginning, from the cultural and historical foundations of both legions, through every decision point and every moral failure and every moment of genuine tragedy, all the way to the long shadow the event throws across 10,000 years of history. We're going to sit with the uncomfortable questions that this story raises and try not to reach for easy answers, because this is not a story that has easy answers. This is not a simple story of good versus evil. There are no clean heroes here, and there are no pure villains in the principal cast. There is only a cascade of decisions, each one made by someone who believed, genuinely believed, they were doing the right thing. Decisions shaped by arrogance, yes, and by prejudice, and by the kind of willful blindness that comes when someone loves their own perspective too much to genuinely consider alternatives. But also decisions shaped by love of knowledge, love of the emperor, love of brother warriors, love of a home that had taken centuries to build. And at the end of all those decisions, made by fallible beings caught in a situation that was itself partially engineered by forces working against all of them, there is a planet in ruins and a civilization of scholars turned into servants of a chaos god they never asked to worship. That's the kind of story this is. So settle in, get comfortable, turn down whatever else is competing for your attention. Let this wash over you slowly, the way it deserves. Because we're going all the way back to the 31st millennium, up to a time when the Emperor of Mankind's sons were still alive, and the Great Crusade was still spreading the light of the Imperium across the galaxy, and when two of those sons, mirror opposites in almost every way, products of worlds that couldn't have been more different, embodying values that rubbed against each other like tectonic plates, were already moving, step by deliberate step, toward the worst morning either of them would ever live through. This is the story of Magnus the Red and Leman Russ. This is the story of scholars and wolves. This is the story of Tzeentch's perfect plan, executed through the ambitions and the failures and the best intentions of mortals. Even immortals have their mortality when it comes to the things that matter most. This is the burning of Prospero, explained in full. Part 1. The world at the edge of knowledge. To understand why Prospero matters, why its destruction reverberates the way it does through 10,000 years of history, you first have to understand what it was before the fire came. Prospero was not always the shining jewel of psychic civilization that it became. In the ancient period before the Great Crusade reached it, before the Emperor's fleet spread the light of the Imperium across the stars, Prospero had already suffered its own apocalypse. The lore tells us that thousands of years before the events we're discussing tonight, a catastrophic wave of uncontrolled psychic energy swept through the planet's population. The precise cause has been debated and lost to time, but the result was anything but subtle. That the psychic surge drew in a species of terrifying indigenous creatures called the Psychnuane. Imagine something like an enormously dangerous parasitic predator, one that targeted psychers specifically, hunting the very gift of psychic ability like a wolf hunts warmth. They reproduced by implanting their eggs directly into the brains of psychically active hosts, and in the chaos of that ancient catastrophe, they nearly wiped out every thinking being on the planet. The survivors, the ones with enough psychic power and enough collective will to act, retreated to a single fortified commune. A cluster of buildings on a coastal mountainside, surrounded on all sides by ruin. This settlement, barely more than a last redoubt against extinction, was called the Tzeentch commune. And it was here, behind walls of stone and force, held together by the combined telekinetic will of the survivors, that humanity on Prospero endured. They developed their psychic gifts, not as weapons, but as tools of survival. They learned to generate kind shields, invisible barriers of solidified psychic force, and those shields kept the Psychnuane at bay. Generation by generation, they rebuilt. The commune grew. It became a settlement, then a city, then something extraordinary. By the time of the Great Crusade, Tzeentch had become arguably the greatest center of psychic learning and scholarly achievement in the entire galaxy. The city was designed from the inside out by a mind capable of holding its entirety in a single thought. The mind of Magnus the Red himself, as the Primarch who came to Prospero and found there a people who understood him in ways that his brothers, for all their superhuman gifts, never quite could. Picture the city as it was in its glory days, built on a radial pattern from the center, all roads and canals spiraling outward from the great central pyramids like the spokes of a wheel. a design that maximized order and beauty simultaneously. Every structure in Tzeentch, every home, every workshop, every library, every hall of learning was built to be both functional and visually harmonious. The buildings were clad in pale marble and polished glass that caught the light and threw it back in shimmering fractals. The great pyramids at the city's heart were reflective, designed so that looking at the skyline you would see Tzeentch and sky at once, at the city merging with the heavens above it in a way that felt almost like a philosophical statement about the relationship between knowledge and aspiration. At the center of it all stood the 8 great temple arcologies, massive pyramid structures, each one dedicated to one of the psychic cults that structured the Thousand Sons Legion's understanding of their own gifts. And the grandest of these, the Pyramid of Photep, was the personal sanctum of Magnus himself, a vast repository of forbidden lore and sorcerous experimentation that even the Legion's own senior officers were rarely permitted to enter. Surrounding these central pyramids was the Great Library of Tzeentch, a glass and gold building of breathtaking ambition, topped by leaves of hammered metal and guarded by a great golden arch. By the end of the Great Crusade, this library was arguably the greatest repository of human history and culture in the entire galaxy. The Thousand Sons collected knowledge the way other legions collected battle honors. Every world the Great Crusade reached and brought into compliance, the Thousand Sons took records. They preserved histories, technologies, art, philosophy, and most controversially of all, they preserved knowledge of the warp and psychic phenomena that the rest of the Imperium would rather have forgotten or destroyed. The result was a library unlike anything else in existence, a place where a scholar could spend 1,000 years and still find corridors unexplored and shelves unread. And the people who lived here, who maintained this library, who walked these pyramid-shadowed streets, they were not warriors by nature. They were scholars, or they were intellectuals. They were a civilization built around the proposition that knowledge is the highest calling, that understanding the universe is more valuable than conquering it, and that the psychic gift, properly developed and properly understood, was not a curse to be feared, but a treasure to be cultivated with care. These were the people who would welcome their Primarch when he finally came to them. These were the people who would become the Thousand Sons. And these were the people who, in the space of a single terrible dawn, would watch everything they had built be reduced to cinders and smoke. But before we can understand the destruction, we need to spend a little more time inside the Legion itself. Because the Thousand Sons were not simply scholars in power armor, they were something far more complex, far more fascinating, and yes, far more dangerous than that. The Thousand Sons structured their Legion around 5 distinct psychic cults, each one corresponding to a different discipline of psychic ability. It was a system developed under Magnus, one that took the raw, often uncontrolled gifts his legionaries possessed and shaped them into something approaching an art form. The Corvidae were the seers. Their gift was precognition, the ability to read the shifting threads of probability and see what was likely to come. In battle, they guided strategy, sensing the currents of chance and steering their brothers toward the outcomes most favorable to the Legion. Their power made them the Legion's primary intelligence gatherers and strategic planners, and their leader, Chief Librarian Rubric of Ahriman, was one of the finest tactical minds in the entire Legionis Astartes. The Corvidae were the most powerful and prestigious of the cults at many points in the Legion's history, their ability to foresee danger making them invaluable. Critically, as events approached their terrible crescendo, someone or something began suppressing the Corvidae's gifts from without, deliberately blinding them to what was coming. The Pyrae were the opposite of the Corvidae in almost every way. Where the seers were measured and contemplative, the Pyrae were pyrokinetics, masters of fire in all its forms. They were loud, brash, aggressive, and prone to a certain theatrical flair that the other cults found exhausting but ultimately had to respect. A Pyrae could generate and control fire drawn directly from psychic energy, fire hot enough to melt ceramite fire that could burn in the vacuum of space. In battle, they were living artillery, and their pyramid in Tzeentch was the one topped not by a golden symbol, but by an ever-burning flame that never went out. The Raptora were the Legion's protectors in the most literal sense. Their discipline was telekinesis, the movement and manipulation of physical matter through psychic force. A skilled Raptora could hurl a battle tank across a battlefield, or pluck a bolter shell from the air before it reached its target. Most importantly for our story tonight, the Raptora could generate something called a Kine shield, a barrier of invisible, solidified psychic force that could stop almost anything. Individual shields were impressive enough, but amassed working, dozens or hundreds of Raptora combining their power into a single expression of telekinetic will could generate something that defied comprehension. Something that could hold against orbital bombardment. Something that, when the fire finally came to Tzeentch, would be the only reason any of the city survived the first few minutes of the attack. The Athenians were telepaths, readers of minds and projectors of thought. Their battlefield role combined intelligence gathering with what amounted to psychic communication, allowing the Legion to coordinate across distances and through interference that would have defeated any conventional means of communication. They could pull enemy strategies directly from the minds of opposing commanders, and they could reach into the consciousness of an opponent and plant doubt, of confusion, or sheer overwhelming psychic pressure. Finally, the Pavoni were physiokineticists, specialists in the manipulation of biological processes. They could heal wounds, enhance the physical capabilities of their brothers, and in battle, they could turn their gifts into something terrifying, boiling the blood inside an enemy's veins, or generating lightning from their own nervous systems. They had a reputation within the Legion for a certain vanity, a preoccupation with beauty and physical perfection that the other cults found mildly irritating. Together, these 5 cults formed the core structure of the 15th Legion, and they gave the Thousand Sons a flexibility and depth that most other legions simply could not match. In the field, they could predict enemy movements, shield their own forces behind impenetrable barriers, reduce enemy positions to flame, read the minds of their opponents, and manipulate the physical world in ways that conventional weaponry simply couldn't counter. On paper, they were one of the most formidable legions in existence. But there was a shadow at the heart of all this brilliance, and it had been there since before the Great Crusade even began. The Thousand Sons mutated. Uncontrolled, grotesque, random mutation. The kind that turned a warrior into something that could no longer be called human. They called it the flesh change, and it had nearly destroyed the Legion in its earliest days. Warriors who had been perfectly functional one day would begin to shift and transform the next, their bodies reshaping themselves in ways that had nothing to do with intention and everything to do with the raw, an unfiltered influence of the warp that coursed through their gene seed. Some became monstrous, some became simply wrong. The ones who survived the transformation were often no longer themselves. Magnus found a solution, a deal struck in the shadows with a power of the warp that stabilized the Legion and appeared to halt the flesh change entirely. But the nature of that deal, the cost of it, was something Magnus kept from his sons. And that secret would eventually become one of the fault lines along which everything broke. Part 2. The Sons of Fenris. Now let's pull our gaze away from the golden pyramids and the incense smoke of Tzeentch and travel to a world as different from Prospero as it is possible to imagine, while still being technically habitable to human life. Fenris. If Prospero was a paradise of carefully ordered knowledge, Fenris was its opposite in every possible sense. A death world in the most honest meaning of that term, Fenris was a planet of ice and fire in constant violent rotation. Its year cycle was dramatic enough to reshape the landscape entirely with each pass of its seasons. Glaciers advanced and retreated. Volcanoes erupted with predictable regularity, filling the sky with ash that blotted out the sun for months at a time. The seas themselves were alive with creatures that treated any vessel smaller than a large warship as prey. The land between the frozen wastes and the volcanic ridges was populated by megafauna that would have been considered legendary monsters on any gentler world, alongside humans who had, over countless generations, become something very close to legendary themselves. While the people of Fenris lived by a code forged in the same furnace as their world, stark, uncompromising, and deeply beautiful in its own way. Honor was not an abstraction on Fenris. It was a physical thing, something you carried and demonstrated and defended with your life if necessary. Strength was respected, courage was expected, death in battle was preferable to surrender, and a warrior who died fighting was celebrated in song long after their name would otherwise have been forgotten. The tribes of Fenris organized themselves along lines of loyalty and kinship, pack structures that made total sense given the predator-haunted world they called home, where the difference between surviving and not often came down to whether the people around you could be trusted absolutely when it mattered. Into this world fell Leman Russ. His gestation capsule came down hard on the flank of a vast mountain, and the infant Primarch emerged into a world that should have killed him within the first hour. But fate had other ideas, or perhaps something in the Primarch's nature recognized a kindred spirit in the wilderness. A mother thunderwolf, one of Fenris's apex predators, enormous and ferocious and possessed of a near-human cunning, found the child and did not kill him. Instead, she raised him alongside her cubs. Leman Russ grew up as much wolf as man, running with the pack, hunting, fighting, surviving in ways that would have been impossible for any ordinary human. Eventually, he was found by the tribesmen of King Thengir's people and brought into the human world. And here is where you see something fascinating in the young Primarch, because despite the feral upbringing, despite the years running on all fours through the wilderness, Leman Russ took to human society with a speed and hunger that suggested he had been waiting for it. He learned their language in weeks, he mastered their weapons in days. His tactical mind, so obvious even then, took the chaos of Fenrisian tribal warfare and bent it towards something approaching genius. By the time King Thengir died, Leman Russ had become the greatest warrior Fenris had produced in living memory, and he took the king's throne as naturally as if it had always been his. When the Emperor's fleets came to Fenris, they heard the legends of the Wolf King, a being who had united the fractious warring tribes of this impossible world, who led from the front of every battle, who could fight all day and drink all night, and rise the next morning ready to do it again. But the Emperor recognized his missing son immediately, and came to claim him in the manner that only the Emperor could, by descending in person and issuing a challenge that the young Leman Russ, in his pride and confidence, could not refuse. 3 times they competed, eating, drinking, and finally fighting. And 3 times the Emperor bested his son. It was not humiliation, but revelation. Here was something greater than even Leman Russ had imagined. And when it became clear that this stranger was his father, his creator, the bond that formed was absolute and total. Leman Russ understood hierarchy in the way that only someone raised in a pack truly understands it. There is the pack, there is the alpha, and you serve both with everything you have. The Emperor was his alpha in the deepest sense that concept meant anything to the Wolf King. And this devotion, fierce, uncomplicated, and without reservation, would define every decision Leman Russ made for the rest of his life. The Space Wolves Legion that Russ inherited and reshaped in his image reflected their Primarch absolutely. They called themselves the Vulca Fenrica, the Wolves of Fenris, in their own language, and they meant it not as metaphor but as genuine description. Their culture was built around the sagas, the oral tradition of heroic narrative that Fenrisian society used to transmit everything from history to moral code to tactical doctrine. A space wolf who achieved something great had their deeds recorded in song, and those songs were performed and refined and added to over generations. To be remembered in a saga was to be immortal in the only way that mattered. As they organized themselves into great companies, each one led by a wolf lord and built around the bonds of personal loyalty that characterized everything about Fenrisian culture. Unlike many legions that operated through formal hierarchy and written protocol, the Space Wolves ran on trust. If you had earned your place, you had it absolutely. If you betrayed that trust, there was no recovery. The rigidity of the Codex Astartes, which would come later, was something they would resist categorically, because it substituted abstract rules for the living bonds that actually held the Legion together. And their Primarch's feelings about psychic power are essential to understand here, because they're one of the foundational tensions of everything that follows. Leman Russ despised sorcery. Not all psychic ability. The Space Wolves had their rune priests, warriors who channeled something they called the power of Fenris rather than the warp, though the distinction was philosophical at best and arguably non-existent at worst. But what Russ saw in the Thousand Suns, the deliberate, studied, controlled invocation of power drawn from the warp itself, the bargaining with entities within the Imperium for knowledge and capability, this he found dishonorable in the most fundamental sense he knew. For a warrior raised to value straight-ahead strength and courage above all else, the idea of winning a battle through manipulation and invisible forces felt like cheating. It felt like cowardice dressed up in academic robes. And this gut-level revulsion at what the Thousand Suns represented would not soften over time. It would calcify, become a part of the Wolf King's identity, as much as his wolf companions Freki and Geri, as much as the Frostblade Mjolnir that he carried into every battle. The hatred was old before the Horus heresy began, and by the time it ended, it had become something that would outlast both of them. Part 3. The rivalry before the fire. The relationship between Leman Russ and Magnus the Red was complicated long before it became catastrophic. On paper, they shouldn't have clashed as often or as bitterly as they did. Both were loyal to the Emperor. Both fought hard for the Great Crusade's success. Both cared deeply about their legions and the warriors who served under them. But the values they each embodied were so fundamentally opposed. Brute force and physical courage against intellectual cunning and psychic power, or direct honesty against layered subtlety, the wolf pack against the library. That friction was almost inevitable. There's a moment earlier in the Great Crusade that crystallizes this tension beautifully. During the joint campaign in the Arcreach cluster, the Space Wolves and Thousand Suns operated together and managed to hold together through the shared demands of combat. But at the conclusion of the campaign, a dispute arose over the fate of the Great Library at Arcreach Secundus, a repository of knowledge that the Thousand Suns desperately wanted to preserve and study, and that Leman Russ viewed as a potential source of dangerous information that should be denied to any who might misuse it. The confrontation became heated enough that only the intervention of Lorgar, the word-bearer's Primarch, had prevented it from becoming outright violence. And even so, Russ made a blood vow that day, something deeply serious in the Fenrisian tradition, a promise carried in the body rather than just the mouth, that he and Magnus would settle their difference eventually. On other campaigns, the Thousand Suns' use of psychic powers in ways that Russ found strategically and morally objectionable grated at him constantly. They would subdue entire planetary populations through telepathic suggestion where the Space Wolves would have fought through them. They would use precognition to avoid engagements that, to a warrior raised on the principle that battle is the proper expression of a warrior's worth, should simply have been fought. Every tactic that felt to Russ like a shortcut felt to Magnus like elegant efficiency, and neither of them had much patience for the other's perspective. Mortarion of the Death Guard was another voice raised against Magnus, and his hatred ran even deeper, and from a more personal place. Mortarion had come from Barbarous, a world where the ruling class of Xenos sorcerers had lorded their psychic power over humanity for generations, and the sight of Magnus and his sorcerers drew from him the same instinctive revulsion he had spent his entire life building against the things that had enslaved his people. His voice at the Council of Nikaea would be among the most damning. And Corvus Corax and Rogel Dawn both refused to commit their legions to campaigns alongside legions that fielded librarians, the formal term for psychic warriors, citing concerns about reliability and safety that may have been genuine, but also served to isolate the Thousand Sons politically within the Legion hierarchy. So by the time the Council of Nikaea was called, Magnus was not walking into a neutral forum. He was walking into a room where the verdict had, in significant ways, already been decided by the accumulated weight of grievance and suspicion that the other Primarchs had been building against him for years. Part 4. The Council of Nikaea, where it all began. The Council of Nikaea was held in 001 M31 during the later years of the Great Crusade, and if you want to find the seed of the burning of Prospero, this is where it was planted. The Emperor called the council because the question of psychic powers within the legions had become something that could no longer be safely ignored. Across the Crusade, as the fleets pushed further into unexplored space, they encountered more and more beings and phenomena that bore resemblance to what Magnus and his Thousand Sons practiced. Demons, psychic predators, warp entities of various levels of intelligence and malice. All of these drew power from the same great ocean that the Legion's librarians tapped into when they exercised their gifts. The question being asked, urgently, by many of the Primarchs and their senior officers was whether there was any meaningful difference between a Thousand-Son sorcerer and a Xenos psyker using the same energy from the same source. Nikaea itself was chosen for its neutrality, a world in its geological infancy, far from the politics of any major system, and equipped with facilities appropriate for an event of this scale. The Emperor himself attended, with Malcador, the Sigillite, officiating. Security was provided by the Adeptus Custodes, though a substantial force of space wolves, 3 great companies' worth, was present at Lehman Russ's insistence, ostensibly as a safety measure in case things went wrong. The Space Wolves' presence was not subtle. The first speaker to rise was Otheri Wyrdmake, a rune priest of the Space Wolves. Given his status as a psyker himself, though the Space Wolves would deny that term with considerable vehemence, many present expected him to defend the Thousand Sons. What he delivered instead was a detailed denunciation of the Thousand Sons as warlocks and deceivers, drawing on his personal experience fighting alongside them during campaigns on Shrike and Agoru. He framed their use of power not as the disciplined exercise of a natural gift, but as a deliberate invocation of dangerous forces that the wielders could not truly control. Mortarion followed with his own testimony, personal and bitter, and drawing on his history on Barbarous, in ways that clearly moved the assembled leaders, even as they made Magnus visibly uncomfortable. The Death Lord's hatred of psychic power was not abstract philosophy. It was written in the suffering of his entire childhood and his entire homeworld, and it rang with a genuineness that Magnus's more intellectual arguments struggled to match. Magnus himself spoke, and by all accounts the sheer power of his rhetoric was extraordinary. He wove arguments drawn from philosophy, history, and practical military reality into something approaching a work of art. He argued that the psychic gift was not inherently dangerous, but inherently powerful, and that power, like any power, could be refined and directed through proper study and discipline. He invoked Plato's allegory of the cave, of people who could not conceive of light because they had spent their lives in shadow, suggesting that those who feared the warp did so because they had not devoted the time to understanding it that he and his sons had. He was eloquent, he was brilliant, and he was almost certainly right in many of his specific points. But there was something about Magnus's performance at Nikaea that didn't quite land the way he needed it to. And it's worth pausing to think about why. The Emperor had been very clear, repeatedly, about his concerns regarding the unrestricted use of psychic power. He had a project underway on Terra, a secret of extraordinary scope that required the warp to remain as calm and controlled as possible. The nature of that project, which we'll discuss shortly, meant that any large-scale, uncontrolled exercise of psychic power was a direct threat to something that the Emperor considered among the most important things he had ever undertaken. Magnus's arguments, however brilliant, were being made in a room where the Emperor had already made his decision, and where Magnus's history of ignoring warnings in favor of his own judgment had damaged whatever goodwill might otherwise have existed. Behind the scenes at Nikaea, something else was happening. The Space Wolves had brought with them a human member of their retinue, a scholar, an oral historian named Caspar Horsa, whom they suspected of being a hidden one, an unwitting psychic spy placed by the Thousand Sons. This suspicion was being used by Leman Russ as evidence of the Thousand Sons' duplicity, an illustration that even when not in battle, they used their gifts to undermine and manipulate. The accusation was serious, and while the full truth of Horsa's situation was considerably more complicated than either side understood at the time, the fact of the accusation hung over the proceedings like smoke. When the Emperor finally spoke, his decree absolute was unambiguous. The use of sorcery, defined as the invocation of psychic powers through deliberate bargaining with or drawing upon the intelligent entities of the warp, was banned across the Imperium and within all legions. Navigators and astropaths, who used the warp in tightly controlled and regulated ways, were sanctioned to continue, but librarians were to be disbanded and their practices abandoned. The legion-wide use of psychic powers in combat was over, and then the Emperor looked at Magnus specifically and spoke words that can only be described as a personal condemnation. He acknowledged that Magnus was brilliant. He acknowledged that Magnus cared for his sons and for the Imperium. And then he told him, in front of every Primarch and senior officer assembled, that his arrogance and recklessness made him dangerous, that his insistence on pursuing knowledge without regard for the risks he created for others was a flaw that could not be permitted to continue. Magnus left Nikaea publicly humiliated and privately furious. He had lost the argument, been called out by his father in front of his peers, and been ordered to cease the very activities that he believed made his legion valuable and himself meaningful. The decree was just, but the delivery was a wound that never closed. And then he went home to Prospero, and he kept practicing sorcery in secret. Part 5. The Vision and the Warning that Broke the Universe. Before we get to what Magnus saw, let's talk for a moment about what it was actually like to be Magnus the Red in the years between Nikaea and the disaster. Because this is one of the most psychologically interesting spaces in the entire Horus heresy. The period in which a man who genuinely loved his father continued to do exactly what his father had told him to stop doing, and believed, in the most sincere way possible, that he was right to do so. Magnus returned from Nikaea wounded in his pride and his sense of self-worth in a way that he would never fully acknowledge. He was not a man who found humility easy. His entire life, his discovery of Prospero, his transformation of it into a center of psychic learning, his cultivation of the Thousand Sons into something extraordinary, his decades of exploration at the very edges of what was possible, all of it had been built on a foundational certainty that Magnus the Red was right, that his understanding of the warp was not dangerous, but enlightened, that the Emperor, if only he could be made to truly understand what Magnus was doing and why, would recognize the value of it. Nikaea had told him, with the full weight of the Emperor's authority, that he was wrong, and Magnus could not accept that, not internally. He accepted it in performance. He returned to Prospero. He told his sons that they would comply with the decree absolute. He went through the motions of compliance. But in the deep privacy of his own mind and his own pyramid, the research continued. The exploration of the warp continued. The cultivation of the Thousand Sons as an organization of psychic warriors continued in secret, carefully, and behind a facade of compliance that fooled everyone, except perhaps the chaos entities who were paying close attention to Magnus for their own reasons. There is something very human about this, if you step back far enough to see it clearly. Magnus didn't stop because he was certain he was right, and certainty is one of the most powerful forces in the universe when it comes to justifying behavior that contradicts what you've been told. He had devoted his entire existence to the proposition that knowledge was the highest good and psychic power was its finest expression. To abandon that was to abandon himself. He couldn't do it. So the years passed, and Magnus kept working, and the warp kept stirring at the edges of his perception. And the future that the Corvidae seers struggled to read kept throwing up images that were hard to interpret, but impossible to ignore. Several years passed between Nikaea and the next moment that matters for our story tonight. Years during which the Great Crusade continued, during which Magnus and his 1,000 sons remained outwardly compliant while inwardly pursuing exactly what they had been told to stop, and during which the rot at the heart of the War Master Horus's soul was deepening in ways that nobody yet fully understood. Magnus, meditating in his pyramid on Prospero, was peering into the warp with an intensity that should have been warning enough. The Corvidae cult's gift of precognition was being exercised at the highest level. Not the battlefield precognition of combat prediction, but something deeper and more frightening, and a genuine attempt to read the overarching movements of fate for the entire Imperium. What he saw stopped him cold. He saw Horus. He saw what was happening to the War Master on the world of Davin. A chaos ritual facilitated by the word-bearer Erebus and a group of Davinite cult members, a deliberate poisoning of the most powerful of the Emperor's sons with the influence of the ruinous powers. He saw the betrayal that was coming, brother turning against brother, legions splitting apart, the civil war that would tear the Imperium apart at the seams. He saw everything except, fatefully, his own role in what was to come. Magnus attempted to intervene directly. He entered the warp as an astral projection and tried to reach Horus's mind while the War Master was still in the grip of the ritual, trying to pull him back from the edge by force of argument. It didn't work. The corruption was already too deep. The influence of the Chaos Gods already too settled into Horus's psyche, and Horus himself too far gone in his resentment of the Emperor and his belief that he had been abandoned and disrespected. Magnus left that encounter knowing that what he had feared was true and that he had failed to stop it. Now he faced a decision that would determine the fate of everything. He needed to warn the Emperor. He needed to get a message to Terra. The normal channels, astropathic communication, the psychic network that connected the Imperium's worlds, were blocked. A warp storm of some kind, whether natural or manufactured, was interfering with the usual paths. Magnus had no reliable way to reach his father through conventional means. And so he made the choice that sealed his own fate, and arguably the fate of the entire Imperium. He would send the warning himself, directly, in person, as an astral projection blasting through the warp with all the psychic force of the most powerful psyker alive, short only of the Emperor himself. He assembled his senior sorcerers. He conducted a massive ritual that required considerable power to execute, and he sent his consciousness blazing through the warp toward Terra, like a psychic comet, burning across the immaterium with a ferocity and intensity that left trails visible to every psyker in that sector of the galaxy. On Terra, the Emperor had been at work for years on his secret project, a project of breathtaking ambition, an attempt to adapt the ancient Eldar webway, e.g. the network of tunnels through subreal space that the Eldar used for instantaneous travel, for human use. If it succeeded, human civilization would no longer need to navigate the dangerous, demon-haunted chaos of the warp to travel between worlds.
Okay, I want to stop for a second and just be real with you. I've gone through a lot of 40k lore on this channel, and Prospero genuinely bothers me every single time I revisit it. Not in a bad way, in the way that good storytelling is supposed to bother you. Because when I actually sit with it, I find myself shifting who I'm frustrated with every few minutes. Like, I'll be thinking about Magnus and feel nothing but sympathy. The guy was right. Horus was betraying the Emperor, the warning was valid, and then 2 seconds later I remember he broke the webway, blighted his own legion, stripped his own planet's defenses and just waited. And the sympathy gets complicated. And then I think about Russ. This is a man who I genuinely believe he thought he was doing the right thing, but he also had decades of built-up hate for the 1,000 Sons, making him very ready to believe the worst version of his orders. That's not innocence, that's something uglier. And honestly, my personal read is that Tzeentch, I don't know how to pronounce it, is the only winner here, and that's the most depressing part of the whole thing. But anyways, that's just my take on it. Let's go back to the video.
Entire fleets could move through the webway in absolute safety, immune to the predations of whatever lived in the space between spaces. The project had been underway for nearly 2 centuries, and it was at an extraordinarily delicate stage. The psychic infrastructure required to maintain a stable, human-compatible corridor through the webway was intricate beyond description, and the wards the Emperor had erected to keep warp entities out of the corridors while this work continued were similarly complex and similarly fragile. The Magnus crashed through those wards like a boulder through a spider's web. His astral projection arrived in the throne room of the Imperial Palace on Terra with all the subtlety of an artillery strike. The wards shattered. The carefully maintained barriers between the Webway project and the warp dissolved. Demons poured in through the breach in their thousands, howling through corridors that had been meticulously constructed to exclude them, tearing through the work of 2 centuries in minutes. Thousands of workers, adepts, and servitors who had been laboring on the project were killed instantly, their minds unable to handle the psychic shockwave of the Primarch's arrival. The Webway project was effectively destroyed in the moment of Magnus's arrival. And the consequences of that destruction would continue to cascade for 10,000 years, for the damage was permanent, and it would eventually require the Emperor to take up permanent residence on the Golden Throne to maintain the barrier between the Webway and the Warp, the beginning of the living death that the Master of Mankind has endured ever since. Magnus delivered his warning. The Emperor heard him. And then the Emperor, who had just watched 2 centuries of work destroyed in a moment by a son who had been repeatedly told not to use sorcery, was furious in a way that transcended ordinary anger. He didn't even initially accept that the warning about Horus was real. He couldn't believe that his most beloved son, his greatest achievement as a general and as a father, could have truly fallen to chaos. What he could believe, when what the evidence directly in front of him made impossible to deny, was that Magnus had done exactly what he had been told not to do, with consequences that were literally catastrophic, and that this was not the first time this had happened. He called for Leman Russ. The original order was for Magnus to be brought to Terra to face judgment, arrested, not executed, charged with violation of the edicts of Nikaea and the destruction of the Webway project, brought before the Emperor to answer for what he had done. That was the original order. Capture, not annihilation. But there was someone else with access to those orders, someone who had been waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity, and someone whose entire grand strategy for destroying the Emperor depended on weakening and isolating loyalist legions as much as possible before the moment of open war. Horus intercepted the orders. Part 6. The Manipulator's Hand. Horus changes everything. Understanding Horus's intervention is central to the full moral weight of what happened to Prospero, because without it, the story is tragic, but comprehensible. With it, the story becomes something far darker, a testament to just how thoroughly the architect of fate had structured events to serve its purposes. Horus, already fully committed to his rebellion and beginning to position his forces for the open break, received intelligence that the Emperor had dispatched Leman Russ to Prospero with orders to arrest Magnus. He saw immediately the possibilities. If Magnus was arrested and brought to Terra, the Emperor would have a powerful psyker, arguably the most powerful psyker alive besides himself, working alongside him during the heresy. Magnus's loyalty might be shaken by the arrest, but it might also be restored through the relationship with his father. More significantly, Magnus and the Thousand Sons, as a fighting force, could be an enormous problem for Horus's plans. A legion of disciplined psychic warriors with the ability to see the future would be extraordinarily difficult to deceive, and Horus's entire strategy for the early phases of the Civil War depended heavily on deception. Better, Horus reasoned, to have Magnus destroyed. Or better still, to have Magnus destroyed in a way that forced him into Chaos's arms, converting him from a potential loyalist threat into an asset for the traitor cause. The War Master sent emissaries to Leman Russ. The exact details of what was said and how it was framed vary slightly depending on which sources you consult. But the core of it was consistent. Horus convinced Russ that the Emperor's true intent was not arrest, but punishment, and that punishment required destruction. He worked on Russ's existing hatred of sorcery, his years of built-up contempt for Magnus and everything the Thousand Suns represented, his righteous indignation at what the psychic Primarch had done to the Webway project. And here is where we have to be honest about Leman Russ, because the full picture of what happened is not entirely comfortable for those who view the Wolf King as a simple hero. Russ was not stupid, he was not unsophisticated. He was one of the finest tactical minds in the Legion's Astartes. But he was also a man who had spent decades building a worldview that positioned Magnus and his kind as fundamentally dangerous, and Horus was offering him a frame of understanding that aligned perfectly with what Russ already wanted to believe. The voice of Horus, telling him that the Emperor wanted Magnus dead, found soil that had been prepared to receive exactly that seed. There is a detail in the lore that makes this even more painful to examine. Before committing his forces to the attack, Russ actually attempted to contact Magnus. He believed, on the basis of the Space Wolves' intelligence about Caspar Horsa, that Horsa might be one of the Thousand Suns' hidden ones, an unwitting psychic conduit that Magnus used to monitor individuals of interest. When Russ tried to use Horsa to send a message to Magnus, declaring his fleet's approach and offering terms for Magnus to send away the civilians and surrender, it was, in its way, a final chance. But Horsa was not a hidden one of the Thousand Suns. He was, as it turned out, a much older pawn in a much larger game, manipulated by chaos into position to create exactly this kind of failure of communication. The message never reached Magnus, and without normal Vox communication to fall back on, Russ took the silence as confirmation that Magnus had refused. Magnus, for his own part, had also been making choices that narrowed the options available. After the destruction of the Webway project, he had returned to Prospero and done something that, in retrospect, makes a horrible kind of sense, but at the time guaranteed catastrophe. As knowing that the Emperor's wrath was coming, believing that punishment was deserved, Magnus had decided to accept it. He threw a psychic cocoon around the entire planet, blocking all astropathic communication, cutting off his legion's ability to perceive the future. He sent the Thousand Suns fleet away in 4 separate battle groups with sealed orders, ensuring they couldn't defend the planet from orbit. He had taken the defenses apart from the inside, methodically, so that when the Emperor's judgment arrived, it could be delivered cleanly. He wanted to spare his sons the choice between fighting and accepting punishment. He wanted to take the punishment himself, whole. What he did not fully account for, perhaps because the very precognitive gifts that might have warned him were suppressed by his own hand, was what Horus had done to the orders. The censure host that assembled at Beta Garman and made its way to Prospero was not primarily a judicial escort. By the time it left its staging point, it was an assault fleet. Leman Russ commanded a force of approximately 73,200 space wolves, a substantial portion of the entire legion. Alongside them came the Adeptus Custodes, the Emperor's own golden armored bodyguard, in a force led by Constantine Valdor himself. The Sisters of Silence accompanied them, the pariah warriors whose very existence was an absolute negation of psychic power, capable of shutting down even the most powerful psyker simply by walking into range. And with them came something else. 5,000 warriors of the Sons of Horus, sent by the War Master as a personal contribution to the censure. Elements of the Legio Mortis's Titans were listed in the orders as well, though whether they all made it to Prospero is a matter of some confusion in the records. The fleet that dropped into the Prospero system was not coming to make an arrest. It was coming to end something. Part 7. Dawn over Tizca. The fire begins. Prospero's planetary defense systems registered nothing until the moment the fleet was already there. This was not a failure of the defense grid in the conventional sense. The orbital platforms were functional. The defense batteries were charged and ready. The automated tracking systems were operational. But Magnus had shut down the active monitoring protocols that would have given any early warning, and without those, the defenses were reacting rather than anticipating. And by the time they could react, the censure host was already firing. The first wave of ordnance reached Prospero's surface before most of the population even knew there was a fleet in orbit. Imagine standing in a city at dawn. The sky is the particular shade of deep blue that comes just before the sun rises, stars still faintly visible at the edges, the air cool and carrying the salt smell of the Prosperine Ocean. You are walking to a morning's work, perhaps heading to the great library to continue research that has occupied you for the past several months, perhaps to the halls of your cult's pyramid to practice the exercises that keep your gift honed and precise. Yeah, and then the horizon lights up, not with sunrise, with impact flashes. Dozens of them, then hundreds, spreading across the visible edge of the world in a chain of detonations so intense that for a moment it looks like the planet itself is on fire along its rim. The sound comes a moment later, a rolling, continuous thunder that has no clean start or end, just a building pressure that climbs until it's physical, until the ground under your feet is vibrating, and the windows of the buildings around you are shaking in their frames. Magma bombs, mass drivers, directed energy weapons, lance batteries. The Space Wolves fleet hammered the surface of Prospero with everything it had, and within moments of that bombardment beginning, the planet was transformed. Mountains were leveled, not cracked or eroded, but collapsed entirely, their material filling the valleys that had existed beside them for millennia. The seas boiled. The oceans, deep, cold, teeming with the biological life of a genuine paradise world, were flash vaporized into steam, the water table driven from liquid to gas in minutes. The bedrock of the planet, the literal foundation on which the civilization of Prospero rested, was subjected to such intense and sustained energy that it buckled and reshaped itself, geological processes that normally took millions of years compressed into a single, terrible hour. Across the non-Tzeentch surface of Prospero, burning winds swept everything, carrying with them the smell of superheated metal and vaporized stone. In the space of that bombardment, every settlement on Prospero outside of Tzeentch was destroyed. Every farm, every outpost, every community that had developed around the capital, the people who lived there, not sorcerers or soldiers, but ordinary humans who had lived their lives in the shadow of the Thousand Suns civilization, were gone. The lush forests that had covered much of the planet's surface, the crystal-clear rivers, the vast plains that the planetary records describe as beautiful, all of it burned. Only Tzeentch survived. The Raptora cult's Kine shield held. When the first bombardment shells began to fall toward Tzeentch, a group of Raptora sorcerers, knowing nothing of what was happening, responding purely to the sudden overwhelming threat descending on their city, combined their telekinetic power and extended the greatest shield they had ever attempted over the entirety of the capital. The Raptora pyramid had been training its members in exactly this kind of emergency, and when the moment came, they were ready in the way that only years of devoted practice can make you ready. The shield went up over the city like an invisible dome, and the bombardment broke against it. It was not without cost. The sheer force of the orbital strikes that struck the shield was enormous, and that force had to go somewhere, transferred back through the psychic connection to the sorcerers maintaining the shield, killing several of them as the impacts overloaded their concentration and shattered the mental structures holding the barrier together. They held. Others stepped into the gaps left by the fallen. They kept holding. The city was shaking, the streets cracking from the sympathetic damage, yet the buildings trembling under the transferred percussion of orbital bombardment, but the shield held. And then, when the bombardment paused and the wolves saw that Tzeentch still stood, Leman Russ made his decision. They would go down. The landing craft descended from the fleet in numbers so enormous that observers on the ground initially could not process what they were seeing. The shapes in the sky were too numerous, too small, distributed too broadly across the visual field to be immediately identified as what they were. For a moment, people watching from behind the trembling windows of Tzeentch thought they were seeing some kind of atmospheric debris kicked up by the bombardment. Particles, fragments, clouds of superheated material drifting down from the burning sky. Then the shapes grew larger, and the truth became undeniable. As the space wolves were landing in such force that the sky was simply full of them, Leman Russ himself was the first to set foot on Prospero. Part 8. The Battle for the City of Light. The Prospero Spire Guard, the human soldiers who formed the normal ground defense for the planet, mobilized with what must have been a terrifying combination of courage and confusion. They had received no warning, no orders from the Thousand Suns, no intelligence about what was approaching them. They scrambled their fighters to intercept the landing craft, and those fighters were destroyed almost immediately. They were human aircraft, meeting transhuman armor-plated assault ships in numbers that made the engagement absurd. The pilots died in seconds, but their commanders on the ground watched them disappear from their displays and tried to understand what they were facing. One of the more remarkable figures in this initial phase of the battle was Caton Aphia, heir to one of Prospero's oldest families, commander of the Palatine Guard, a young officer who by any measure of conventional military talent was exceptional. In the time available to him, he positioned his troops at the edge of the Space Wolves' deployment zone with a tactical brilliance that his officers later described as the finest improvised defensive deployment they had ever seen. He found kill boxes in the streets, established overlapping fields of fire, prepared ambushes that took full advantage of the city's winding old quarter. But he did everything right that it was possible for a human commander with mortal soldiers to do when facing an assault by post-human warriors. The Space Wolves overran his position in less than 2 minutes. 6,000 Space Marines and Custodes, in a direct assault against human troops, however brilliantly led, is not a battle. It's an inevitability. Aphia's lines shattered, and then they collapsed, and Tzeentch began to burn at its edges as the Space Wolves established their beachhead and started pushing inward. It was at this point, with the city being torn apart around them and the sounds of bolter fire and Space Wolf war-joyment echoing through streets that had never heard such things, that Magnus's blanket of psychic suppression finally lifted enough for the truth to reach his senior commanders. They reached out through the warp and through conventional communication and found each other and found, piece by piece, the shape of what was happening to their home. Magnus's order was to stand down, to not resist, to accept this. Ahriman refused. It's worth sitting with this moment because it's one of the most quietly significant acts of individual will in the entire Horus heresy. Ahriman, chief librarian and first captain of the Thousand Suns, looked at what was happening to Tzeentch, the burning, the slaughter, the systematic destruction of everything his legion had built, and decided that surrendering to it without resistance was wrong. Not just tactically wrong, morally wrong. Whatever Magnus had done to provoke this, the people in those streets deserved better than to be led to slaughter in silence. The knowledge in those libraries deserved better than to be let burn without anyone trying to save it. He took command, and with that, the battle for Tzeentch truly began. The Thousand Suns distributed their forces across Tzeentch with a precision that their training made possible even in the chaos of the opening assault. Ahriman himself took the eastern defensive line, commanding the Scarab Occult, the elite Terminators of the First Fellowship, in a gun line intended to slow the Space Wolves' advance. Phocis Takar and Hathor Maat, leaders of the Raptora and Pavoni respectively, held the western approaches. Phile Toron defended the port area where the initial landing had been most concentrated. The Athenians held the center. Their telepathic gifts put to work maintaining communication across a battlefield where normal signals were being jammed by the Sisters of Silence as they moved into position. The early exchanges were brutal on both sides. The Thousand Suns, fighting as a legion of psychic warriors defending their home, were formidable in a way that even their opponents had to respect. Ahriman, his precognitive senses working at full capacity, could read the wolves' attacks as they were forming, could see the bolter rounds coming before they were fired, could anticipate charge directions, could position his forces to meet each assault with exactly the response it needed. The Space Wolves, accustomed to meeting enemies who broke under the psychological pressure of their assault, found themselves fighting warriors who not only didn't break, but seemed to know what was coming and had already prepared for it. The Adeptus Custodes entered the engagement with their characteristic aggression, riding their jet bikes into hit-and-run attacks against the Thousand Suns' defensive positions. They were extraordinarily dangerous individually, each one a post-human warrior trained specifically for direct combat against the most dangerous opponents in the galaxy. But the Thousand Suns discovered something with their first successful counterattack. Despite their formidable reputation, Custodians died just as certainly as anyone else when struck by concentrated psychic energy. An Athenaean could reach through the Custodian's armor with a mind spike, while a Pirate could bathe a jetbike formation in warp fire that no physical armor could block. For a time, a precious, blood-soaked time, the Thousand Suns held. But then the Sisters of Silence arrived in force, the Silent Sisterhood, Anathema Psychana in the formal language of the Imperium, but known to friend and foe alike as the Witch Hunters, the Null Maidens, were the absolute negation of psychic power made flesh. Not warriors who resisted psychic attacks or who carried equipment that blocked such things, but beings whose very existence in the material universe was a dead zone in the warp, an absence of the psychic potential that connected living things to the immaterium. Where an ordinary human existed in the warp as a small, faint presence, a Sister of Silence existed as nothing at all. A gap. A void that swallowed psychic power the way a black hole swallows light. When the Sisters of Silence moved into the Thousand Suns' defensive line, the effects were immediate and devastating. The sorcerers of the Thousand Suns began to lose access to their gifts. Not because they were being blocked or suppressed in any mechanical sense, but because the presence of the pariah warriors created zones where the connection between the material universe and the warp simply did not function. A Corvidae seer, trying to read the threads of probability, found only white noise where the future had been. A Pyre, trying to generate flame, found nothing to draw from. The kind shields of the Raptora flickered and failed. The words of Athenaean mind contact dissolved into incoherence. The Thousand Suns choked on their own spells. But there was a moment that several accounts describe, where Ahriman, still fighting, still leading, still trying to hold the eastern line, astral projected himself out of his body and met the Space Wolves' rune priest. Other Weirdmake, in the psychic plane, above the physical battle. They fought there, two psychers wrestling in the substance of the warp itself, while below them their physical forms stood surrounded by combat. Ahriman won, and in the moment of victory, he did something extraordinary. He forced his consciousness into Weirdmake's mind, and he dumped everything there. The whole truth of Prospero, the Webway project, Magnus's attempt to warn the Emperor, Horus's manipulation of the orders, the whole tragic chain of decisions and misunderstandings and deliberate deceit that had brought them to this moment, this burning city. As this battle between brothers that neither side had truly wanted and that chaos had engineered from beginning to end. Whether Weirdmake fully absorbed that truth, whether he communicated it to Russ, whether it mattered at all by the time it reached anyone who could act on it, that is one of the great ambiguities of this story. The battle was already happening. The momentum was already in motion. During the battle, one of the more spectacular and desperate moments came from Magister Caliphis of the Pyre cult. Finding himself and his brothers outgunned, the Pyre sorcerer did something that no conventional military doctrine would have sanctioned, and that only someone with his particular gifts could have managed. As he reached out with his pyrokinetic power and took control of Canis Vertex, a dormant warlord-class battle titan that stood as a guardian at the gates of the Pyramid. Normally, a warlord titan required a princeps and MIU link and a full crew to operate. Calophis drove it with his will alone, feeding power into the machine through his connection with the warp, using the titan as a physical extension of his psychic force. The results were exactly what you'd imagine from a warlord titan being wielded by an extremely angry, pyrokinetic sorcerer in defense of his home. Vast and terrible and destructive enough to hold off the Space Wolves' advance for a significant period, buying time that was measured in lives on both sides. The battle for Tizca lasted long enough for the Thousand Sons to evacuate as many civilians as possible to the Pyramid of Photep, the southernmost and most defensible of the central pyramids, the personal sanctum of Magnus himself. Street by street, pyramid by pyramid, they were pushed back. The great library fell. Its shelves burned. Centuries of accumulated knowledge, records from 100 worlds, histories that existed nowhere else in the universe, the distilled scholarship of an entire civilization, turned to ash while the people who had devoted their lives to preserving it died trying to defend it. The Thousand Sons lost a great deal in Tizca. 9/10 of the Legion's strength was broken during that battle. The surviving warriors and what civilians could be gathered were driven back to that final defensive point at the Pyramid of Photep, and there they made their last stand. And then Magnus came down from his pyramid. Part 9. Two Brothers on a Causeway. There is a specific image that crystallizes the burning of Prospero for me, and I think it will stay with you too if you let it settle. Two giants, standing on a causeway leading to the Pyramid of Photep, the last standing monument of a civilization that is burning around them. Everything is fire. Everything is ruin. The great library is ash. The Corvidae pyramid is cracked and dark. The eternal flame that burned atop the Pyri pyramid has been extinguished for the first time in living memory, and these two are at the center of it, or walking toward each other with the certainty of a collision that has been building for decades, a collision that some part of both of them recognized as inevitable long before the fleet ever translated into the Prospero system. The causeway itself is remarkable to think about. It leads to the Pyramid of Photep, the sanctum of Magnus himself, the southernmost of the great central structures of Tizca. The other pyramids have fallen or been abandoned. The surviving Thousand Sons, and whatever civilians could be moved, have retreated here, to this final point. And around the approach to the pyramid, the remnants of the fighting are still visible. Bolt casings, scorch marks, the shapes of fallen warriors on both sides cooling in the morning air that is no longer morning air, but something darker and thicker with smoke, and the residue of spent psychic energy. Magnus descends from his pyramid and moves toward the causeway. Standing taller than any space marine had a right to stand, copper-skinned and one-eyed, the single great eye that remained after the other was sacrificed to forbidden knowledge burning with a light that came from somewhere other than the material universe. Robed and armored both, carrying in his bearing the weight of absolute certainty about what he was doing and profound grief about why he was doing it. He was not coming to the causeway to win. He had already accepted that this battle was lost, that his punishment was deserved, that this was the price of his arrogance. He was coming because Ahriman had refused to surrender, because his sons were dying in the streets behind him, because someone had to face Rust directly, and because, buried under the grief and the acceptance, there was still something in Magnus that refused to go gently. Leman Russ. Carrying the frostblade Mjolnir, its teeth pulled from the jaw of a great kraken, a weapon built for someone who was built for violence in the most fundamental way possible. Armored in grey and fur, flanked by his two enormous wolf companions Freki and Geri, his eyes carrying the cold certainty of a predator who has found his prey and intends to do what predators do. He was not enjoying this. There was too much old friendship between them for pure enjoyment, too much of a relationship that should have been brotherhood. But he was not going to stop either. When they met, the battle around them paused, or seemed to pause. The accounts describe the duel of the Primarchs as something that created its own stillness in the surrounding combat. Warriors on both sides, stopping to watch two of the greatest beings alive, try to kill each other in the ruins of a burning city. Magnus fought with everything he had. He wrapped the causeway in etheric lightning, psychic energies that struck and burned and blindfolded Russ's senses. He reached out with his mind and hammered at the Wolf King's consciousness, trying to break his concentration, to insert enough doubt and confusion to create an opening. He healed his own wounds in real time, his Pavoni gifts working alongside his raw power to regenerate damage that should have been debilitating. He drove his arm through Leman Russ's chest at one point, his fingers closing around one of the space wolf's hearts, and for a moment it seemed like it might be over. Russ broke the arm. Here is something worth understanding about Leman Russ. The Space Wolf's suspicion about his Primarch-level resistance to psychic attacks was not unfounded. Russ was not fully immune to psychic assault, but he was extraordinarily resistant to it in a way that went beyond the normal Primarch baseline. There were those who believed, and there was evidence for this belief, that Russ had been deliberately designed by the Emperor to be an anti-psychic weapon. The Emperor's executioner, the one who could be sent against even the most powerful psyker among the Primarchs, and not be overwhelmed by what he faced. Whether this was true design intent or an emergent property of his gene seed, yet the practical effect was the same. Magnus's most devastating attacks were finding less purchase than they should have. The duel peaked and crested and came finally to its terrible end when Russ, in a blind retaliatory strike, after Magnus had lashed him with a concentrated psychic assault, swept his blade in an arc and caught Magnus across his remaining eye, the one eye left to the Crimson King, the one eye that, perhaps more than anything else about him, symbolized what his pursuit of forbidden knowledge had already cost. Magnus staggered, blinded, and Leman Russ grabbed him, picked him up, lifted the Primarch of the Thousand Suns, copper skin and ancient power and all, and broke his back across his armored knee. The sound, according to the accounts, carried across the causeway. Every Thousand Suns warrior who was still standing felt it, or like something fundamental in the architecture of the universe had cracked. Magnus fell to the ground. Mjolnir swept down in the killing arc, and then Magnus, broken-backed and blinded, did the last thing anyone could have predicted. He reached out through Ahriman, used his chief librarian as a conduit, a vessel for a spell of such scale and scope that no individual could contain it unassisted, and he spoke words of power that had been prepared, quietly, against exactly this outcome. Words that Tzeentch, the changer of ways, had been waiting to hear. Every surviving Thousand Sun on Prospero vanished from the surface. Mjolnir struck the causeway where Magnus had been lying. The Wolf King stood in the wreckage of a city he had destroyed, looking at a space that was empty where his greatest enemy had been moments before, and heard the last thing Magnus said to him as he disappeared. "You are a sword in the wrong hands, Leman Russ." Part 10. The Bargain and the Damnation. Magnus had not escaped through his own power alone. He had been saved, if that word can mean anything in this context, by Tzeentch, the chaos god of change and sorcery, whose grand designs had always included this exact moment. Tzeentch, whose nature is the endless ramification of plots within plots within plots, had been working on Magnus for longer than Magnus had realized. The voice in the warp that had offered Magnus the extra power he needed to breach the webway corridor on his way to Terra. That power came with a cost that was not stated in the moment, but that Tzeentch had always intended to collect. The salvation offered on the causeway of Photep came with a cost as well. Was Magnus, his sons, what remained of Tizca, and all the knowledge within it, were transported through the warp to a world that Tzeentch had prepared, a demon world deep within the eye of Terra called Sortiarius, the planet of the sorcerers. And in making that transportation possible, Magnus bound himself and his legion to Tzeentch in ways that could not be undone. The Crimson King, who had spent his entire life insisting that knowledge could be wielded without corruption, that the psychic gift could be exercised without surrendering to the entities that existed within the warp, found himself fully and finally in the changer of ways embrace. On Sortiarius, they found Tizca waiting for them. Not a ruin. The city itself, transferred whole through Tzeentch's will, its pyramids intact. Now its libraries, at least those within the city walls, still containing the knowledge that the Thousand Sons had spent decades accumulating. The price was paid. The deal was done. And Magnus, looking at the preserved city of light floating in the midst of the Eye of Terror's nightmare unreality, made his final choice. He would fight the Emperor. He would fight alongside Horus, not because he wanted the heresy to succeed. By this point, he was beyond caring about Horus's crusade in any sincere sense, but because what had been done to Prospero demanded an answer, and the only answer available to him now was war. Back on Prospero, the Space Wolves surveyed what they had done. The censure host had taken substantial casualties of its own. But the Space Wolves alone had approximately 25,000 dead, a significant fraction of their total legion strength. The Sisters of Silence and Custodes had their own losses. The campaign had used so much ammunition and materiel that the Space Wolves entered the broader Horus heresy significantly degraded, unable to engage in major sustained operations for the months that followed, while their losses were at least partially replenished. The 13th Great Company, led by Jorin Bloodhowl, had pursued the Thousand Sons into the warp as they vanished, plunging into the Eye of Terror in an act of defiant dedication that their brothers watching would remember for 10,000 years. They were never seen again in any conventional sense, lost in the infinite shifting madness of the Eye, fighting there in ways that mortal memory cannot fully account for. The black stone in the Grand Annulus, where their record should have been stood as witness to their absence. Leman Russ reportedly stood in the ruins for some time after the battle ended. What he was thinking, what he felt looking at the smouldering remains of a civilization he had just destroyed, the accounts do not tell us directly. But there is a story, transmitted in the Fenrisian saga tradition, that the Space Wolves used to preserve their history. That before he left Prospero, Russ looked at what had been the Great Library and understood, in some quiet corner of his warrior's heart, that he had done something that would not sit easy with him. That the blood vow he had made against Magnus was fulfilled, and it had not felt the way he had thought it would. But he would learn later fully what Horus had done to his orders. His rage at that revelation was reportedly extraordinary, not regret exactly, but the specific fury of someone who has been used, who has been made into someone else's instrument, who has been given a script to perform while believing it was his own choice. Part 11. The Aftermath. Bodies and Consequences. The burning of Prospero did not end on Prospero. Its consequences extended outward in all directions, rippling through time with a force commensurate to its original impact. Magnus and what remained of his legion arrived on Sortiarius damaged, reduced, and bound to a chaos god who delighted in their predicament. The Thousand Sons that had survived, perhaps 1/10 of the legion's pre-battle strength, were deeply shaken, grieving for their dead and their home and their destroyed knowledge, uncertain what came next. Magnus himself was physically broken in ways that would have killed any ordinary space marine, sustained only by the power of Tzeentch and the warp. He would rebuild, in time, and his ascent to Demon Primarch would restore what the physical damage had taken. But the man, the scholar, the seeker after truth, the son who genuinely loved his father, that man died on the causeway of Photep. In the months after Prospero, the Thousand Sons faced the return of the flesh change. Having aligned themselves with Tzeentch, the god of mutation and change, the same genetic instability that Magnus had bargained away years ago came roaring back. Tzeentch is not a god who grants stable gifts. The surviving warriors of the 15th Legion began to mutate again, their bodies shifting and reshaping under the influence of the Eye of Terror and their new patron's divine attention. Some became something inhuman. Some were consumed entirely. Ahriman watched this happen and decided, once again, that he would not accept it without a fight. He had the Book of Magnus, the Primarch's personal tome of forbidden knowledge, bequeathed to him in those final moments on Prospero before the escape. He had the most powerful surviving sorcerers of the Legion, and he had an idea. A spell of extraordinary ambition, something that would draw on the Legion's collective power and use it to purge the flesh change permanently. He began to recruit a cabal. He studied. He planned. He executed the Rubric of Ahriman with everything he had. The results were exactly as catastrophic as you'd expect from someone trying to use the power of a chaos god of change to stop change. The rubric swept across Sortiarius in a storm of blue and yellow lightning that lasted for what felt like an eternity to those caught in it. Every member of the 1,000 Suns was struck, and the outcome divided starkly along the line of psychic ability. Those who had significant psychic gifts, fewer than 100 of the Legion's survivors, absorbed the lightning and were transformed rather than destroyed. Their powers were dramatically amplified. Their connection to the warp deepened and strengthened in ways that went beyond what training alone could have achieved. These were the survivors, and the exalted sorcerers who would form the command structure of the 1,000 Suns through the 10,000 years that followed. Everyone else had their body reduced to dust inside their armor, not destroyed, not killed in the conventional sense. The dust that had been their physical body was sealed inside their power armor by the rubric itself, and their souls, unable to leave, unable to rest, were trapped there with it, aware, imprisoned, no longer able to think or feel or act independently, but enduring forever in a nightmare of static existence inside the walking coffins of their own power armor. These were the Rubric Marines, the Rubrici, the animated dust in painted shells that anyone who plays 1,000 Suns on the tabletop knows as the iconic, eerie, as hollow warriors who march without commands into the guns of whatever enemy has drawn their sorcerer's attention. There are entire libraries of tragedy in those silent suits of armor, if you think about it long enough. Magnus was furious when he learned what Ahriman had done, personally and specifically furious. He had lost his sons a second time, turned the survivors of Prospero's burning into something that couldn't think or feel, stripped away their individuality in the name of preventing mutation. He nearly killed Ahriman in that rage, but Tzeentch intervened. The god of change was entirely pleased with how things had developed. A legion of powerful sorcerers commanding hollow automata that embodied the aesthetic of change and transformation at its most extreme. This was exactly the sort of instrument Tzeentch found useful. Ahriman's life was spared. He was instead exiled from the planet of the sorcerers, cast out to wander the galaxy as a lone scholar of forbidden power, still searching for a way to undo what he had done, still trying to find the combination of knowledge and sorcery that would restore his brothers. That search has never ended. It continues into the 41st millennium, 10,000 years later. Part 12, The Long Echo, the feud that survived the heresy. 10,000 years is a long time, long enough for dynasties to rise and fall, for stars to shift in their courses, for entire civilizations to be born and collapse without leaving enough evidence to reconstruct them afterward. And yet the feud between the Space Wolves and the 1,000 Suns has survived every millennium of that span, a burning with a consistency and intensity that says something profound about the nature of both legions and the wound inflicted by that single, devastating day on Prospero. The Space Wolves never forgot. Their culture, built around the preservation of saga and memory, embedded the burning of Prospero into their foundational identity. Every Space Wolf knew the story. Every Space Wolf knew that Magnus the Red was out there, somewhere in the Eye of Terror and its environs, nursing his grievance and waiting for his moment. The blood vow Leman Russ made against Magnus passed in some sense to the Legion itself. Not formally, not in writing, but in the way that all the most important things in Space Wolf culture passed, through the telling and retelling of stories that shaped who they were. And Magnus never forgot. If Russ eventually came to something approaching regret for what had happened on Prospero. Not guilt, perhaps, but recognition that he had been used and that the price had been wrong. Magnus arrived at something far simpler and far more consuming. He was angry. He remained angry. 10,000 years of anger, refined and concentrated and eventually transmuted through the alchemy of chaos into something that was almost beautiful in its terrible consistency. He expressed that anger most directly in the 32nd Millennium, when he orchestrated an assault on the Space Wolves' homeworld of Fenris itself, the Battle of the Fang. He spent decades engineering the conditions for the attack, luring the Space Wolves' great wolf Harek Ironhelm away from Fenris on a hunt, and then descending on the mountain fortress known as the Fang, with the full power of his reconstituted Thousand Sons. The Fang was the most defensible structure on Fenris, possibly one of the most defensible structures in the galaxy, and even with the advantage of surprise and a diminished garrison, the assault was brutal and costly. Magnus came close, genuinely close, to achieving his revenge at scale. The Space Wolves held, barely, in a defense that cost them enormously, but they held. And in the era of the Psychic Awakening, in the time of the 41st Millennium that the tabletop game calls the present day, the Thousand Sons returned to Fenris with even greater force. Driven by Magnus himself, guided by Ahriman's stolen knowledge of the webway, they struck at the Space Wolves' home system in a campaign that brought in allies from unlikely places, corrupted key figures through the genius of the Changeling, and very nearly ended the Space Wolves as a functioning chapter. Grey Knights and Dark Angels came to the Wolves' aid. The combined forces drove the Thousand Sons back, but the wounds were real. Leman Russ himself has been absent from this feud for 9,000 of its 10,000 years. After the end of the Horus heresy, troubled by what he had done on Prospero, and by the state of a galaxy in which his father lay broken on the Golden Throne, Russ announced a great hunt and disappeared into the Eye of Terror with his personal retinue. He left behind only Bjorn the Fell-Handed, the oldest living dreadnought in the galaxy, who was there on Prospero, and who has fought the Space Wolves' battles for 10,000 years in the absence of his Primarch, and a prophecy called the Wolf Time, a promise that when things were at their absolute worst, when the galaxy itself was on the edge of final ruin, the Wolf King would return. Whether that return is coming, whether Russ is waiting somewhere in the eye for the moment to reveal itself, whether Magnus genuinely knows where his brother is and simply chooses not to share that information with anyone. These are questions that remain open as of the present day's lore. What is not open is the wound itself. The burning of Prospero created a rift that no amount of time has fully healed. As a grievance between two of the most powerful entities in the 41st Millennium that continues to shape conflicts 10 millennia after the City of Light turned to ash, Part 13. The moral weight. Who did nothing wrong and who did everything wrong? We've spent a long time inside the facts of what happened on Prospero. Now, let's sit with the question that the Warhammer fan community has been arguing about ever since Graham McNeill wrote it down in the novel A Thousand Sons. A question that the source material itself refuses to answer cleanly, because the honest answer is that there is no clean answer. Did Magnus do nothing wrong? The meme exists for a reason. Magnus was trying to warn his father. He was trying to prevent a catastrophic civil war. His intentions, stripped of everything else, were good. But he saw what was happening, and he tried to stop it. And the method he chose, the method Tzeentch helped him choose, though he didn't know it, destroyed something precious and irreplaceable as a side effect. But let's be honest about what Magnus actually did, because the internet meme sometimes collapses the nuance in ways that the law doesn't support. Magnus was told, explicitly, repeatedly, by the Emperor himself, not to use sorcery. He agreed to stop. He went home to Prospero and continued practicing sorcery in secret. He cultivated a legion of psychic warriors in direct defiance of a ruling that the Emperor had made at Nikaea. He lied about this compliance for years, and then, when the moment of crisis came, his solution was the most powerful, most dangerous, most reckless psychic act he could possibly have committed. One that, or even if the Webway project hadn't existed, would have been a massive, uncontrolled discharge of warp energy with unpredictable consequences. The destruction of the Webway project was not simply bad luck. It was the predictable result of someone taking an action they had been specifically told not to take, in exactly the way they had been specifically told not to take it, with the specific result that warnings had predicted. Magnus's intentions don't erase that. His love for his father doesn't erase it. His genuine desire to save the Imperium doesn't erase it. At the same time, Horus lied. Horus changed the orders. Horus turned an arrest into a destruction, deliberately, as part of a plan to push Magnus toward chaos. The Emperor ordered Russ to bring Magnus in, not to burn Prospero. On that point, the law is quite clear. Was the destruction of the planet, the loss of 9/10 of the Legion, the burning of the Great Library? None of that was what the Emperor commanded. It was what Horus arranged, and Leman Russ accepted orders he should have questioned more carefully. He had existing hostility toward Magnus that made him receptive to an extreme interpretation of his mission. He chose to interpret Horus's silence as refusal, rather than attempting direct communication through normal channels. He was not innocent. And the Emperor who saw everything, who placed Russ in this position, knowing his existing feelings about Magnus, who sent a Primarch who hated psychic power to arrest the most powerful psychic among his sons, carries his own portion of this weight. His furious rejection of Magnus's warning, his immediate assumption that Magnus was the traitor rather than Horus, his beloved Horus, tells you something about where the Emperor's vulnerabilities lay. This is the thing that the burning of Prospero does that makes it special in the Warhammer canon. It doesn't give you a villain to hate and a hero to root for. It gives you a tragedy in the classical sense, a situation in which almost everyone made bad choices. Many of those choices were understandable given what each person knew and believed, and the result was a disaster that none of them fully intended and all of them contributed to. The one genuine villain in the piece is Horus, whose manipulation was deliberate and whose goals were the destruction of the Imperium. But he couldn't have done any of it without the pre-existing tensions, the years of grievance, the Emperor's blind spots, and Magnus's arrogance. Tzeentch, of course, sits behind everything and laughs. The Changer of Ways has a unique relationship with the burning of Prospero. In some ways, it's one of the defining achievements in Tzeentch's endless, galaxy-spanning scheme to ensure that things never stop changing, never settle into the stability that might one day allow something like order to take hold in the universe. Two loyal legions destroyed each other's ability to function. One was driven into chaos service. The Emperor was forced onto his throne. The Webway project was ended before it could be completed. The Horus heresy gained its shape and direction in part from the absence of Magnus from the loyalist cause and his presence among the traitors. And the feud between the Space Wolves and Thousand Suns continues to distract, damage, and destabilize Imperial forces 10 millennia after the fact. That's a return on a single day's investment that is almost incomprehensible in its scale. Part 14. Legacy. What the fire left behind. Let's talk about what the burning of Prospero means for the present day of Warhammer 40,000, because it's worth making explicit just how deeply this single event shaped the galaxy we know. The Thousand Suns, as they exist in the 41st Millennium, are a direct product of Prospero's burning. Every Rubric Marine, every hollow suit of animated armor marching silently through the battlefields of current 40k, is a casualty of that day, trapped in a cycle of duty without consciousness, serving without understanding, fighting for a cause that the soul inside the armor can no longer meaningfully evaluate. Then they are walking monuments to catastrophe. Every time you see those iconic blue and gold pauldrons on the tabletop, you're looking at the visible shape of what the burning cost. Ahriman himself, the Legion's greatest sorcerer and one of the most powerful individual entities in the 41st Millennium's canon, is defined entirely by his response to Prospero. His search for knowledge, his wandering quest to undo the rubric and restore his brothers, his raid on the Black Library that cost him access to knowledge that might have helped him. Every part of what makes Ahriman who he is traces back to that morning in the City of Light, when he refused Magnus's order to stand down and instead chose to fight. Magnus the Red as a demon Primarch, the Cyclopean terror of the 41st millennium, the being who led the assault on Fenris, who re-emerged from the Eye of Terror in the days of the Psychic Awakening, whose tower on Sortiarius is a monument to his 10,000-year obsession with knowledge and revenge. He too is entirely the product of what happened on Prospero. Before the burning, Magnus was arrogant and reckless and brilliant and, in his own way, genuinely devoted to his father and the Imperium. After Prospero, the path to that version of himself was simply closed. What emerged from Tzeentch's bargain and the planet of the sorcerers was something that preserved the intelligence and the power, but replaced the love with something colder and more durable. The Space Wolves themselves carry Prospero as a wound. Their absence from the Siege of Terra, a direct result of the campaigns that followed their expedition to Prospero, as the ambushes and the battles that depleted them so badly that they couldn't reach Terra before it was over, is something that haunts the chapter's self-understanding. They missed the final battle. They were supposed to be the Emperor's executioners, and when the Emperor needed them most, they were elsewhere. Whether or not this is fair, whether Horus's manipulation of the mission is itself responsible for that absence, is beside the point in terms of how the Space Wolves experienced it. And the Golden Throne itself, the structure on which the Emperor has sat for 10,000 years, in what can only be described as a form of living death, sustaining the Astronomicon that guides human spacecraft through the warp, yet maintaining the barriers that keep the worst of the warp from pouring into real space through the wound that Magnus inadvertently created. That is the ultimate legacy of Prospero. The Emperor's imprisonment on the Golden Throne is directly traceable to the events of a single morning in a city that no longer exists. Every psyker burned in the Emperor's name to feed the Golden Throne. Every navigator family whose sons and daughters must be surrendered to the black ships for sanctioning. Every blind eye turned, every atrocity committed in the name of preventing psychic corruption from spreading through the Imperium. All of it flows, ultimately, from the decision Magnus made on a night on Prospero when he reached for knowledge one more time without fully considering the cost. At closing, the ashes and what they mean. The city of Tzeentch doesn't exist on Prospero anymore. The planet itself is a dead world, declared so after the burning, stripped of designation and abandoned to whatever remains when a civilization is destroyed from orbit. Rogue traders occasionally land there in search of artifacts. Ahriman himself has returned multiple times, drawn back to the ruins of the place that defined him, searching in the ash for something he can't quite name. The dead world gives no answers, but Tzeentch continues to exist, in a way, on Sortiarius. The pyramids are there, changed, corrupted by 10,000 years of exposure to the Eye of Terror. Their gleaming marble becomes something darker and stranger, but structurally recognizable. The libraries are there, the knowledge is there, what survived of it. And Magnus looks at that preserved, distorted remnant of his homeworld every day from his tower, surrounded by the 10,000-year project of trying to forge a weapon from his own grief and turn it against the Imperium that destroyed what he built. That's what the burning of Prospero is, finally. Not just a battle, not just a moment. It's the hinge on which the Horus heresy turned toward its particular shape of tragedy. It's the event that demonstrated with terrible clarity that the Chaos Gods didn't need to corrupt the Emperor's most loyal sons to destroy them. They just needed to put them in each other's way and let the existing tensions do the rest. Two legions, both loyal, both believing they were doing the right thing, both used as instruments by a force that wanted them broken. And the galaxy is still paying the price for that morning's work 10 millennia later. If you've been here with me through all of this, thank you. Genuinely, these stories are long and rich, and they deserve the kind of careful attention that most people don't have time to give them. And I'm grateful for every minute you spent listening. If you're new here and this is your first visit to Q on 40k, I do this kind of deep dive regularly. The biggest stories, the most complex characters, the histories that take 3 hours to tell properly and are worth every second. If this story moved you, if the image of the City of Light burning, of 2 brothers standing on a causeway at the end of everything, as of hollow armor marching for 10,000 years in memory of people who died on a morning in the 31st millennium, if any of that landed in a way that felt significant to you, please leave a comment. Tell me what struck you. Tell me what questions you're sitting with. Tell me whether you think Magnus did nothing wrong or everything wrong, because that conversation is genuinely one of the best arguments in the entire Warhammer community, and I love every iteration of it. Like the video if it helped you understand this story. Subscribe if you want to keep going deeper into the lore together, and share it with anyone you know who loves 40,000 and might not have heard this story told quite this way before. The war continues. The wolves still hunt, and somewhere in the Eye of Terror, the Crimson King watches the stars and waits. And until next time, take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and remember, in the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war, but the stories we tell about it are still worth telling with care. Script for Q on 40,000. Space Wolves vs. Thousand Suns, The Burning of Prospero explained. Research sources: Warhammer, 40,000 Wiki, Fandom, Lexicanum, Bell of Lost Souls, Black Library novels including 1,000 Suns by Graham McNeil and Prospero Burns by Dan Abnett, and supplementary Horus Heresy series materials. Extended reflection: The Sisters of Silence, and what silence means on Prospero. There is something that deserves more attention than the battle narrative always gives it. The role of the Sisters of Silence, and what their presence at Prospero specifically meant in terms of the statement being made about the Thousand Suns. The Anathema Psychana, the Silent Sisterhood, were not simply powerful warriors deployed to handle a military problem. Their presence at Prospero was a philosophical statement about the nature of what the Thousand Suns represented, delivered through the medium of their very existence. The Sisters of Silence were pariahs, individuals born without a presence in the warp, souls that cast no shadow in the immaterial universe, whose physical proximity was itself an absolute negation of psychic power. What you could not practice sorcery near a Sister of Silence, the way you cannot start a fire without air. The conditions necessary for the thing to exist were simply absent. Think about what it means to have lived your entire life defined by your relationship to the warp. The Thousand Suns were psychers from the moment their gene seed was implanted. The connection to the great ocean of psychic energy was as fundamental to them as breathing, as constant as heartbeat. Their identities, their cult affiliations, their roles within the Legion, their relationships with each other, all of it was woven through with the warp's presence. A Corvidae seer had spent decades developing the ability to read the shifting patterns of probability in the Imperium, as a Raptora Telekine had built their entire combative identity around the capacity to shape physical reality with their mind. A Pyromancer had learned to treat the boundary between material fire and warp fire as a personal artistic medium. And then the Sisters of Silence walked into range, and all of it was gone. Not suppressed, not blocked. Gone. The connection simply wasn't there. Couldn't be reached for, couldn't be felt. It was as if a musician had suddenly discovered that they could no longer hear. Not the sound of the music, but the internal sense of it. The ability to reach for melody and find it. The bone-deep certainty that this thing which had defined you since you were formed was still there waiting for you. For the Thousand Suns, that negation was not merely a tactical setback, it was an existential stripping. When the Silent Sisterhood walking through their defensive lines was the physical, embodied expression of the Decree Absolute, not just a policy, but a truth about what the Imperium meant to do with psychic power, how it intended to categorize and contain, and ultimately deny it to the people who most deeply depended on it. There's also something quietly devastating in the tactical mechanics of it. The Sisters moved through the Thousand Suns' positions, not in concentrated battle formations, but in small groups, or individually, threading through the line in ways that maximize the radius of their nullifying effect. Each one was a small dead zone. Together, they created a shifting, spreading curtain of negation that moved through the defenders and turned their greatest weapon against them with total efficiency. What had been a difficult but genuine resistance suddenly became men in expensive armor who had lost the ability to call on half their capabilities, being overwhelmed by warriors who suffered no such limitation. Janesha Kroll, who commanded the Sisters of Silence at Prospero and was one of the most formidable warriors in the entire operation, led her women with a precision that the battle accounts consistently single out, even in a campaign that included Leman Russ and the Adeptus Custodes. She understood that her force's function was not to stand and slug it out with the Thousand Suns. It was to deny, to unravel, to turn the battlefield into somewhere that the enemy's strengths ceased to function. The Sisters of Silence were not the hammer in this operation, but they were the specific tool that removed the foundation from under the structure the defenders had built, and they wielded that function with the absolute professionalism of people who had spent lifetimes training for exactly this. There is also a more personal dimension to the Sisters' presence that some sources hint at. The Thousand Suns had encountered the Silent Sisterhood before. Several of the Legion's accounts mention the particular discomfort that even the most powerful Thousand Suns sorcerers felt when forced to share space with pariah warriors. Not fear, exactly, but a visceral wrongness, the sensation of standing next to an absence that should be a presence. Unlike the Space Wolves, whose animosity was direct and verbal and aggressive, the Sisters of Silence were silent. They said nothing. They expressed nothing. And there is something about fighting an enemy who does not acknowledge your existence as a psychic being that goes beyond physical danger into something closer to philosophical terror. The Great Library. What was lost in the fire? Let's slow down and spend some time with what actually burned in Tzeentch, because the numbers and the names in the battle reports don't quite capture the scale of the loss. The Great Library of Tzeentch was, by the time of the burning of Prospero, the largest single repository of human knowledge in the galaxy, not in the segmentum, not in the Imperium, in the galaxy, period. The Thousand Suns had spent the entirety of the Great Crusade, 2 centuries of military campaigns across hundreds of worlds, gathering knowledge with the same systematic thoroughness that other legions applied to conquest. And every newly compliant world was assessed not just for military assets and economic productivity, but for its libraries, its archives, its oral traditions, its technological databases, its philosophical and artistic heritage. The Thousand Suns took records. In cases where the knowledge was particularly valuable or particularly vulnerable, they took originals. Picture the scale of what that represents. 200 years of comprehensive archival work, conducted across literally hundreds of worlds, by a legion whose Primarch had made the preservation of knowledge a founding principle of their identity. The result wasn't just a large library. It was a library whose shelves contained things that existed nowhere else in the universe. Histories of civilizations that had been destroyed or absorbed in the process of compliance, whose surviving documentation now lived only in Tzeentch. Technologies that had been developed on isolated worlds during the long night and never transmitted elsewhere. Philosophical traditions, artistic movements, musical forms, entire languages that had evolved in isolation over thousands of years of humanity's scattered survival. And in the space of a few hours, most of it burned. Not all of it. The Thousand Suns, when Ahriman made the decision to resist and organize the defense, prioritized evacuation of the most critical materials. Warriors who might otherwise have been fighting were diverted to carry sealed containers of data slates and manuscripts and artifacts to the Pyramid of Photep. Librarians who should, by all military logic, have been sheltering in place were instead running through the streets with armloads of irreplaceable records, making judgment calls in real time about what could be saved and what would have to be left. The Great Library itself became a combat zone, its guardian, Anku Anen, leading a desperate defense among shelves that were catching fire even as the battle continued in the galleries around them. What survived made it to the Pyramid of Photep and, eventually, to Sortiarius. The pyramids of Tizca that were transferred through Tzeentch's intervention still contained their libraries and records. The knowledge that was in those physical structures when Magnus spoke his final spell survived the burning of Prospero. But the great library itself, the building, the institution, the accumulated mass of everything that couldn't be moved in those frantic final hours, burned. The wolves' advance through its halls was methodical, in the way that military advances through urban terrain always are, which means it was also destructive in exactly the way that military advances through buildings filled with priceless, irreplaceable records are. Data slates were crushed underfoot. Manuscripts that had survived tens of thousands of years in carefully climate-controlled archives were ignited by the incidental heat of bolt fire passing too close. Shelving systems that had been designed to protect their contents from almost any conceivable disaster crumbled under the forces being applied to them. There is no inventory of what was lost. That's the thing about destroyed libraries. By definition, a no catalogue of the destruction survives, because the catalogue was itself destroyed. What we know is that the greatest repository of human knowledge in the galaxy was reduced to ash and structural rubble in a single morning, and that the things which died in that fire had no copies, had no backups, had no duplicates stored somewhere safer. They simply ceased to exist. The Thousand Sons were, collectively, scholars. That was their identity before it was anything else, even before it was warriors. And what died in the great library of Tizca was the accumulated product of 2 centuries of that identity being expressed in its most constructive possible form. The burning of the library was not just a military action. It was the systematic destruction of an entire civilization's reason for existing. Plus, the long silence of Magnus. What grief does to a Primarch. After Prospero, there is a period in the lore that is difficult to find detailed records of, and I suspect that difficulty is not entirely accidental. The period between Magnus's arrival on Sortiarius and his eventual full participation in the Horus heresy's later events is described in broad strokes. He was there, he was building, he was being gradually absorbed into Tzeentch's service, he was gathering his strength. But the internal life of that period, the day-to-day reality of a Primarch who had just presided over the destruction of everything he had spent his life building, who had watched the civilian population of his home world die, who had seen his sons' bodies fall in the streets of a city they had called home, that is told in fragments and hints. There is a version of Magnus that existed before Prospero that the lore treats as qualitatively different from what came after. Before the burning, Magnus was arrogant, yes, profoundly, sometimes absurdly arrogant, with the specific arrogance of someone who has always been the most intelligent person in any room they've entered, and hasn't quite figured out how to be humble about that without it feeling performative. But he was also genuinely curious, genuinely caring toward his sons, genuinely devoted to his father, even when his behavior didn't reflect that devotion. He argued with the emperor. He defied the emperor's edicts. But he loved the emperor in a way that was real and complete. The love of a created being for its creator, a son for the most extraordinary father imaginable. After Prospero, yet that love was warped into something barely recognizable, not destroyed. You can't quite destroy that kind of foundational love. It's too deeply structural, but twisted, perverted by grief and betrayal, into something that expressed itself primarily as its opposite. Magnus's subsequent campaigns against the Imperium, his assaults on Fenris, and his involvement in the broader traitor efforts were not the actions of someone who had stopped caring about the emperor. They were the actions of someone who cared enormously and had concluded that the only emotion left available to him was rage. That is a specific and heartbreaking psychological trajectory, and the Warhammer source material handles it with more nuance than people sometimes give it credit for. Magnus, as a Daemon Primarch, is not a villain who has forgotten what he was before. He is, while in some senses, a memorial to what he was before, haunting the ruins of Tzeentch on Sortiarius, surrounded by everything he saved from the burning, unable to restore it to what it was, because the universe that would have made that possible is gone. There is a very brief account in some supplementary materials of Magnus, in the early years on Sortiarius, spending time in the transported libraries, the ones that survived because they were physically inside the pyramids when the transfer happened, reading, not studying for any tactical or sorcerous purpose, just reading. Working through the shelves the way a scholar does when they have lost their research agenda and are simply rediscovering the pleasure of knowledge for its own sake. And in those moments, before the full weight of Tzeentch's demands made themselves clear, is before the flesh change returned and the rubric happened and the 10,000-year war against the Imperium fully claimed him. In those moments, there is something almost peaceful. He would not get many such moments after that. The demands of being the demon Primarch of the Thousand Suns do not leave much space for quiet reading. The Space Wolves' Reckoning. What it means to be the executioner. The Space Wolves left Prospero carrying their dead and their depleted ammunition reserves and a victory that tasted wrong. This is speculative in some ways. The internal states of the Space Wolves during the withdrawal are not documented with the same detail as some other aspects of the campaign. But the consequences of Prospero for the Space Wolves as a legion are documented clearly. And those consequences tell a story about what the aftermath must have felt like. The Space Wolves had always been the Emperor's executioners. That was their specific function within the Crusade hierarchy. When a Primarch transgressed, when a legion needed to be brought to account, when the Emperor required enforcement action of a kind that his other sons might hesitate over, he sent Russ. It was a role that Russ had understood from the beginning as an honor, the deepest expression of trust, the task given only to the one who could be relied upon completely. You don't send your executioner after someone unless you believe the executioner will not flinch. On Prospero, the executioner had been used by someone other than the Emperor to accomplish something other than what the Emperor intended. Yet the exact mechanics of Horus's manipulation, what he said, how he framed it, the precise words that turned arrest and bring to terror into destroy, became known to Russ eventually, if not immediately. And the reckoning with that knowledge was not something the Space Wolves' culture of saga and honor made easy to process. In the saga tradition, what Russ had done on Prospero was not complicated. He had followed what he believed were his liege lord's orders and prosecuted those orders to completion, suffering substantial losses in the process and achieving the objective as given. By the straightforward calculus of Fenrisian honor, that was duty fulfilled. But in the more nuanced space that even Fenrisian warriors occupied, there was a question being asked quietly in the aftermath. What is the honor of an executioner who was given false information and killed people who should have been arrested? The answer that the Space Wolves culture eventually settled on was complex and not entirely satisfying. Yes, they had been used. Yes, Prospero was more destruction than the Emperor had authorized. Yes, Horus had maneuvered them into a position where their greatest virtue, their reliability, their willingness to follow the Emperor's command without hesitation, had been turned against everything they served. But ultimately, the responsibility for Magnus's choices rested with Magnus, and the responsibility for Horus's deception rested with Horus. What Russ had done was not heroic in retrospect, but it was not pure dishonor either. That ambivalence, that inability to resolve the moral weight of Prospero into a clean account, would sit in the Space Wolves' collective psyche for 10,000 years. It expressed itself in their continued willingness to be the Imperium's hammer when hammering was necessary. It expressed itself in their refusal to fully adopt the Codex Astartes after the heresy, their insistence on maintaining the independence and the personal loyalty structures that made them who they were, even when the High Lords of Terror demanded conformity. And it expressed itself in the feud with the Thousand Suns. A feud that was not simply about Magnus and Russ as individuals, but about what had been done on Prospero, and by whom and why, and whether the people who had done it could look clearly at what it had cost. Leman Russ himself, returning to Terra after Prospero, is described in various accounts as changed, quieter, in some ways. He challenged the Emperor's wisdom openly in ways he had never done before. He expressed regret, not the crushing, self-annihilating regret that might have paralyzed someone else, but the sharp, active regret of a warrior who has made a mistake and intends to understand it clearly enough that it never happens again. He would not get the chance to make the amends he might have imagined. The Horus heresy consumed him, as it consumed everything and everyone in its path. He fought Horus directly at Trisolian and wounded the War Master with the Spear of Russ, a wound that may have contributed to the Emperor's eventual victory, though the sources are ambiguous. He fell into a coma and missed the Siege of Terror, and the fury of that absence from the final battle was something he carried in the years immediately after. And then, eventually, he was gone. The Great Hunt, the Eye of Terror, the Wolf-Time Prophecy, and the promise to return. But before he left, he stood at the Grand Annulus and looked at the Black Stone where the 13th Great Company's record should have been. The company that had pursued the Thousand Suns into the warp on Prospero and never come back, and understood perhaps more clearly than at any other moment in his life that the chain of events that had started with a Primarch named Magnus defying his Emperor's orders had ended by claiming things that could never be recovered. The Tzeentch angle. A god who planned all of this. We've talked about Tzeentch throughout this video. They mentioned the Changer of Ways as a background presence. But let's spend a moment being direct about the scale and the sophistication of what Tzeentch accomplished here, because it deserves to be stated plainly. The burning of Prospero was, from Tzeentch's perspective, not a tragedy. It was a success, an elaborate, carefully constructed success that required putting multiple pieces in place over a very long period of time, and trusting that the specific character flaws and virtues of each piece would produce the desired result when the pressure was applied correctly. What did Tzeentch need? It needed Magnus to be brilliant, ambitious, and arrogant. Brilliant enough to genuinely threaten Tzeentch's enemies, ambitious enough to push further than the limits set for him, and arrogant enough to believe that his own judgment should override warnings and prohibitions when he had convinced himself that he was right. Check. It needed the Emperor to be proud enough to see Magnus's defiance as betrayal rather than desperation, and to love Horus so much that he couldn't perceive the corruption consuming his favorite son, even when Magnus was trying to warn him about it. Check. It needed Leman Russ to hate psychic power deeply and personally enough that the suggestion of escalating his mission from arrest to destruction would find receptive soil. Check. It needed Horus to be far enough down the path of corruption that he would make the manipulation of the orders without hesitation, and charismatic enough that Russ would accept the reframing without sufficient skepticism. Check. Or as it needed the mechanism of Caspar Hauser, a human scholar who could serve as a false lead that prevented direct communication between Russ and Magnus before the attack. Check. It needed Magnus to decide, in his grief and his sense of deserved punishment, to strip his own world's defenses rather than preparing a proper defense. Check. Each of these pieces was a being with genuine free will, making genuine choices. Tzeentch didn't control any of them directly. What Tzeentch did was far more elegant. The god arranged circumstances and pressures in such a way that each person's existing character, existing values, existing fears and loves and grievances generated the needed action naturally. As Magnus's arrogance led him to breach the webway, because Magnus had always been willing to override restrictions when he believed the cause was sufficient. Russ's honor led him to accept Horus's reframing, because Russ had always trusted the word of a brother Primarch, in ways that his own relationships with other Primarchs had never given him reason to doubt. The Emperor's fury led him to act before he fully processed the contents of Magnus's warning, because the Emperor had spent decades managing the problem of Magnus and had run out of patience at exactly the wrong moment. The result: one loyal legion shattered and driven into chaos service. One loyal legion so depleted and entangled that they couldn't reach Terra before the siege. The Emperor's greatest strategic project permanently destroyed. And Tzeentch gains a demon Primarch of extraordinary power, and two enduring factions locked in a feud that will continue to destabilize Imperial affairs for the next 10,000 years. The changer of ways has been called many things in the lore: scheming, duplicitous, infinitely patient. But the cleanest description might simply be this: Tzeentch is the god that wins when people make the perfectly natural decisions that their characters lead them toward. It doesn't need to corrupt anyone, it just needs to arrange the board. Prospero was a board perfectly arranged. A city reborn in darkness, Sortiarius, and what it says about Magnus. There is something worth lingering over in the fact that when the 1,000 Suns arrived at Sortiarius after Prospero's burning, they found Tzeentch waiting for them. The City of Light, our transferred whole through Tzeentch's power, preserved with a fidelity that was almost cruel. The pyramids intact, the libraries present, the streets of old Tzeentch recognizable even on an alien world in the heart of the Eye of Terror. Almost. Not quite. Because the preservation was Tzeentch's preservation, and Tzeentch preserves things the way a taxidermist preserves animals. The form is there, but the life has been replaced with something that imitates it. Over the thousands of years that followed, Tzeentch on Sortiarius became something different from what it had been on Prospero. The majestic spires replaced by disfigured obelisks that merged into the bedrock in ways that violated normal geometry. The pyramids giving way to structures of crystallized earth and pillars of stone that moved and grew and changed according to the planet's own chaotic logic. The libraries still existed, still held their knowledge, but the walls around them pulsed and resonated with demonic energy in ways that drove unshielded minds to madness in minutes. Magnus ruled over this from his tower, the highest point on the planet, looking out at a version of his home that was both preserved and perverted, watching the stars that burned in the Eye of Terror's impossible sky, and conducting the business of being a demon Primarch of Tzeentch. That business, in the decades and centuries after the heresy, was partly military. The Battle of the Fang against Fenris was one of the largest operations, but not the only one, and partly what you might call scholarly. As Magnus continued to study, he continued to accumulate knowledge. The impulse that had led him to build the Great Library in the first place had not been destroyed by Prospero. It had been warped into something darker, a hoarding of knowledge, not for the benefit of humanity, but for Magnus's own purposes, purposes that were increasingly difficult to separate from Tzeentch's purposes in ways that probably bothered Magnus more than he was able to acknowledge. The exalted sorcerers around him, the survivors of the Rubric, the 100 or fewer who retained their psychic gifts and their consciousness, served as the command structure of what remained of the 1,000 Suns. And Ahriman, exiled from Sortiarius, continued his wandering search for the knowledge that would let him reverse the Rubric and restore his brothers. These two trajectories, Magnus accumulating, Ahriman searching, define the post-Prospero history of the 1,000 Suns in ways that continue into the 41st millennium. What does it mean that Magnus built another Tzeentch on Sortiarius? That when given the power to go anywhere, to build anything, to reshape a demon world according to his own vision, what he built was a dark mirror of what he had lost. You could read it as grief expressed architecturally. You could read it as the specific psychology of someone who cannot let go of the past, even when the past is definitionally beyond recovery. You could read it as the mark of Tzeentch's influence, ensuring that its most powerful servant remained tied emotionally to the event that had brought him to its service. All three readings are probably true simultaneously, which is exactly the kind of complexity that makes the 1,000 Suns story so enduring. The City of Light is ash on the surface of a dead world. Its reflection burns with a cold fire on Sortiarius, in the heart of a realm of change. And the man who built both versions stands in his tower and looks out at the stars, carrying 10,000 years of grief and rage and unresolved love in the one heart that remains beating in his chest. The burning of Prospero never really ended. It's still burning, in the only way that really matters. In the consciousness of the beings who survived it and were transformed by it, carrying the fire forward into every day that follows, shaping with that fire every choice they make, and every battle they fight, and every plan they lay for a future that the morning of the burning made sure would never be what any of them had imagined.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.